Sandra, we are greatly honored to have you with us today. We're really looking forward to this unique session on making poems from people's stories. So, Sandra's going to be talking to us about poetic portraiture as representation, inquiry, and community engagement. And she will also be sharing some of her own work in this field. So, without further ado, Sandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I am delighted to be talking with you all today. Thank you to the London Art-Based Research Center for the invitation. I am speaking to you all from the campus of Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio, in the US. Bowling Green State University's campuses are situated in the homelands of the Wyandot, Kickapoo, Miami, Potawatomi, Ottawa, and multiple other Indigenous nations, present and past. This statement is the first step toward fostering an inclusive, respectful, and sustainable community. For those with visual impairment, I am a late middle-aged, fair-skinned white woman with short, curly, reddish hair and some streaks of silver, but that's probably not visible because I turn up the filter on the Zoom. I'm wearing a forest green and black frame plastic glasses, dressed in a black shirt with a sequined purple blazer. And I want to thank the BGSU Institute for Culture and Society for their support of my research and work with older women in the Poetic Portraits project I will be discussing today. I begin with a poem. The Rhythm of Relationships. Life is learning to write the book without a title. Relationships have a heartbeat. Relationships are the rhythm. Relationship, a book without a title. Life is learning to write. This poem that I just presented is part of a poetic portrait that I crafted from an oral history interview with an older woman in Wood County, Ohio, where I live. In this talk, I'm going to present a collaborative project on the life history of older women in the Wood County area, which is a part of the former Great Black Swamp. Wood County is a rural county located in the northwestern part of Ohio in the US, and the population was 132,248 according to the 2020 census. The county seat is Bowling Green. The goal of Portraits of Older Women in the Great Black Swamp was to find inclusive ways to co-construct and portray the life stories of older women in multiple mediums, as well as provide public access to the work. The collaboration included older women in the community, myself, a colleague at my school, and BGSU archivists. I interviewed older women and recorded their stories. I used the recordings in my notes from the interviews to create poetic transcripts and poetic portraits representing women's stories. The recording, poetic transcript, and poetic portrait will be archived in the BGSU libraries for anyone to access and enjoy. And that'll probably happen in, around January of next year. In this talk, I will speak about the method of poetic portraiture, how to create poetic portraits, the importance of focusing on older women, and I will share 3 poetic portraits from the Great Black Swamp Project. I used poetic inquiry in the co-construction and presentation of older women's life stories because it's a good methodology for feminist researchers who are interested in identity, embodiment, and social change. Poetic inquiry is the use of poetry crafted from research endeavors, either before a project analysis, as a project analysis, and/or poetry that is part of or that constitutes an entire research project. In this particular project, I use poetic transcription and poetry as representation. The use of poetry as a representation of interviews has occurred for some time. So for example, Laurel Richardson crafted poetry about Louisa May, who was a participant in a study on unwed mothers. Richardson used creative writing to present both a poem, and I'm quoting Richardson here, masquerading as a transcript, and a transcript masquerading as a poem. Richardson wrote a narrative poem using a 36-page interview transcript, including poetic devices such as line break and enjambment, to capture the rhythmic qualities of the participants' Southern drawl. This poetry is a type of poetic portrait, and poetic portraiture is an art-based research method for representing an interviewee's embodied aspect of their life story in poetry and poetic forms. The method entails using interviews to create poems that represent an interviewee's experience in verse form. So a researcher poet or poet researcher may use poetic portraiture when they want to represent interviews in a nuanced, critical, and evocative manner. A typical method of creating poetic portraits is usually a three-step process. So first, a researcher or research team conducts an in-depth interview with the participant. Second, the researcher crafts a poetic transcript of the interview. Third, the researcher creates a poem or a series of poems that captures the spirit, contours, and specific nuances of the interviewee's life story and experience from the poetic transcript. The poetic portrait may include images and collage to create a textual visual snapshot. It is a series of poems and collage that capture, the interviewee's life story. The use of visual textual portraits then provide the opportunity to include marginalized voices and encourage a range of linguistic and non-linguistic representations to articulate authentic lived experiences. And so I want to talk a bit about poetic transcriptions, and I said that's one of the the second steps here. So for those of you that don't know, poetic transcription involves crafting transcripts in a caring and relational manner in such a way to foreground stories, create verisimilitude, and focus on the essence of the experiences, create coherent storylines, and to create evocative text. So a researcher is transforming the interviews into transcripts that somehow preserve the participants' speaking styles and language. And one way to do poetic transcription is to highlight participants' exact words and language from maybe a traditional interview transcript, cutting and pasting the essential elements in an effort to reveal the essence of participants' lived experiences. So for example, students in my graduate relational communication course in 2021 and students in a course last fall created poetic portraits of older women based on life history interviews that my colleague Wendy Watson and I conducted about older women's close relationships across the life course. And poetry, and here's an example, and I'm taking this from a poetic transcript that I'll be talking about the participant a little bit later in the talk. But this was, one of the questions, how would you describe yourself? I would describe myself as friendly, educated. I'm a lifelong learner, curious, resourceful, a Christian lady, a senior citizen. Did I just say that? Yes, I did, and I am. I am spirited. I think my energy, my passion, and the spirited way that I am doesn't make me think that I was born when George Washington was president. I picture other kinds of faces and people when I think senior, but that's me. So that was an example of a poetic, a bit of a poetic transcript. And students in my class had done that as well. And the idea is that, Galvin and Prendergast talk about poetry as a way to engage participants in aspects of a range of qualitative methods and analysis. It can be used to bear witness and to usefully enliven professional and public engagement with research findings. And I hope that you'll see that once I get to some of the poems, that it certainly is an evocative way to present participants' stories. The poetic portraits that my students had done highlighted the context and influences on older women's life stories. Poetic portraiture of older women can center older women's perspectives in nuanced ways, demonstrating how their life courses met and challenged prevailing notions of relationship trajectories. The use of poetry to represent participants' stories can challenge dominant ideologies and stereotypes by including marginalized perspectives and voices. It's useful for showing researcher reflexivity and can be part of community engaged research, which is how I'm using it. Community engagement is a collaborative and reciprocal process in which members of an institution work with community partners to co-create and implement mutually beneficial activities. So in my role as a professor here at BGSU, working with older women in the community. The women and I collaborated and co-created knowledge of older women's lives that will be shared in our community, which is something that benefits all of us. Connecting the intellectual, social, and emotional facets of learning, such as in the Great Black Swamp Project, benefits community members. And additionally, community engagement projects are beneficial, right, to universities as well, because they often reflect university goals, such as, developing and sustaining community university partnerships that are built on cold knowledge production, an ethos of trust, respect, equal voice and deliberation, reciprocity, solidarity, and mutual benefits. And other benefits of community engagement projects are the real life learning experiences and the potential for transforming staid and stereotypical assumptions. So why this project? The purpose of this Great Black Swamp Project was to co-construct nuanced portraits of older women in the Bowling Green area and their experiences across the life course. I used oral history interviews, and I'm going to talk about 3 participant stories now. I have interviewed 8 women, but I will be interviewing more women right during the course of the fall. And I also anticipate that this project's not just going to be done now, that this is something that myself and other members of the community will keep contributing to. So I used the oral history interviews and poetic inquiry to gather older women's life stories. And oral history interviews provide an invaluable means of generating new insights about women's experiences of themselves in their worlds. They're a good way to gather in-depth knowledge from participants from their own perspective. The interviews and interaction provided the opportunity for older women to tell their story in their own words, deciding what was important to share, what stories they wished to emphasize, and how they presented themselves. Patricia Levy talks about this interview format involves a process of storytelling. The researcher guides a process where each participant narrates their story. The data are generated in a collaborative exchange in which the researcher and research participant are co-creators in the knowledge. Building process meaning is not out there waiting to be revealed, rather meaning emerges throughout the collaborative oral history process. And the idea for this project, in case you're wondering, was really sparked by a comment that a participant in a previous Poetic project had made. So I had described how my students and I had been working on, poetic portraits with women about their relationships. And this participant just remarked to me that there were so many older women in Wood County in the Bowling Green area that had stories that needed to be told and shared, right, with the community. And I thought, at the time I was like, oh, well, maybe an archive project would be a great way to somehow preserve the history of older women in my community, but also provide access to others, because the research interviews that I had done before with my colleague were just that, for research. So we weren't publishing, right, the entire story, right, stories with participants' names attached to them. And so that was some of the impetus then for this project. And more than one participant asked me why I was interested in talking with older women. That was kind of one of the things, like, why are you doing this? And I will tell you, I've always had intergenerational friendships with women. I have fond memories of visiting my mother's women's friends when I was growing up in suburban Atlanta in the 1970s and 1980s, and spending hours really listening to their stories. when I was a safety patrol in seventh grade, I befriended the mother of a third and first grader because I oversaw the hallway where she walked her children to class. And we kept up a friendship and a correspondence, right, for years, right? She even attended my high school graduation. Also, I'm approaching older age as 52 years, yes, believe it or not, is considered late middle age. So the idea of collecting and celebrating older women in my community was appealing on multiple levels. So, why older women's life stories? Older women represent a group that are marginalized and understudied. They experience intersectional discrimination at the intersections of racism, sexism, ageism, and ableism. Older women often report feeling ignored and silenced and may experience invisibility. And, in some research studies, right, it's shown that, older men and younger women actually, right, are more valued, right, than older women in our society. Anecdotal evidence also suggests, and here's an idea if anybody wants for some future research, suggests that older women often experience something called invisibility syndrome. So some women feel that they're seen and devalued, and others feel they are not seen at all. Because we make meaning from life's experiences and identity development as a lifelong pursuit, focusing on older women is important. And I will just say some of these pictures in here, I'm not going to talk about some of their stories, but on the left, Doris Herringshaw is our county commissioner. And then on the right, we've got Barb, who had hand sewn. I don't know if you can see this. It's a quilted jacket that she uses for living history enactments. So this is something that Barb was really interested in, and I had to take their pictures. Oh, and on the left, we see Doris. This is when she was first sworn in as county commissioner. So here's a photo, right, that she has in the plaque. And so in her story, we talked a lot about women in local politics. So the project here that I'm going to talk about is Poetic Portraits of Older Women in the Great Black Swamp. And whoops, sorry about that. Let me go back. Oh, whoops. Let me go back. And like I had said, I had collected oral history interviews with older women, and older women here, maybe I should have started with this, is 60 plus, right, in Wood County. And I focused on four things. One, what their lives are like. Two, the contributions they've made to the community. Three, how their relationship context, situations, and life circumstances have influenced their experiences. And then four, how their experiences across the life course have shaped their sense of self. And like I said, thus far I have talked with 8 women, but it's still ongoing. In fact, I'm doing one next week. And this project, I'll give you some details in case anyone's kind of interested in how that's had done. I had a kind of a flyer that I had posted in some of my Facebook pages, as well as we have a local online independent newspaper, and they did a story, and so many women contacted me that way, as well as through their friends. They're like, oh wait, I just talked to her, you should schedule an interview. And so then I would give the women a list of questions that we could talk about. Some of them talked about them, some of them didn't want to talk about them and just wanted to talk about their stories in their own way. But some of the questions were, how would you describe yourself? What's important to you? What are important relationships in your life? What's your connection to Wood County? How long have you lived here? What does community mean to you? I had a whole list of questions that for some women was, welcome in terms of trying to kind of organize what they wanted to talk about. And so again, some came with, notes for the interviews, right? Some, didn't talk about them at all. I also invited participants to bring photos and other artifacts that they might want to discuss and that we could eventually also put in the archive. So many had brought some photos of important people or events in their lives, or like you saw in the previous slide, the day that Doris was sworn in as county commissioner was something, right, that she wanted to bring and talk about. Um, all of the interviews except for one, and I will get to that in a moment, were recorded on campus because we have some nice recording facilities, because I thought, well, maybe the sound quality would be nice if we're going to put it into the archive. And for those who want to get really nerdy, I put the audio sound into Otter AI, which is a transcription software program to generate the initial transcripts. Then I would go through and kind of listen to them because they weren't perfect, but then I crafted poetic transcripts then from the interviews after listening right to the audio recording and correcting the transcript that Otter AI had generated. Then I used the poetic transcripts and notes that I took after the interviews to craft a poetic portrait for each participant. And the demographics kind of mirror the makeup of Wood County, at least so far. So far I've talked to 7 white women and 1 African American woman, 64 to 80 years old. One had graduated high school, 1 had some college, 4 had MAs, 1 had a PhD, and 1 had an EDD. Okay. The stories that women told were filled with pain and joy, trauma and triumph, the expected and the unexpected. Their feelings about getting older and being old were not always ones that followed a prescribed cultural dictate of embracing cronehood. And what I'd like to do now is to share 3 of the poetic portraits that I created. So first I'd like to talk about Laura, who was a 76-year-old white woman who grew up in Oklahoma and moved to Wood County just a few years ago because her husband had ALS and she wanted to be close to one of her sons. Laura told me that music connects the parts that were missing. She was a music teacher and a singer for years. Her story was one of overcoming a disability she didn't know she had until after she was 40 years old. She was labeled an underachiever in school, and teachers thought she was careless. She only found out in middle age that she had brain damage from her birth. She was born feet first and should have been a cesarean delivery. There was an issue with her brain hemispheres not quite passing information. She was an average student in high school, but did incredibly well on achievement tests and ended up going to Princeton to study music and earned a degree in choral directing in addition to earning an education certificate. And I want you to bear with me for a bit because I want to read the part of Laura's poetic transcription that was about the diagnosis, because I think that this is really at the heart of understanding Laura's story. Diagnosis. It took me a long time to have children. About 9 years ago, I found out I had been a poster child all my life for polycystic ovarian disease. It answered a lot of questions about health and appearance, and all kinds of things for me that were somewhat troublesome. So I spent a lot of my life up to the age of 59 or 60 years old feeling ill. And I had a bad start. I was born feet first and should have been a cesarean section, but my mother's labor was far too long when she got to the hospital, and it nearly killed her. I ended up with some brain damage and some lung damage. Every little cold I caught was a serious illness because my lungs wouldn't clear out. And I had to go to school, like, ugh, not well. And so my early years in school, and I got all the time, "You're an underachiever. You don't care. You won't do anything." I always felt like I was on my last breath. I'd always been getting like D's in gym class. And so I felt really dogged about all of that. I thought, well, I'm never going to be able to explain to people because I look fine and I act fine. But I had this thing where I start talking and mid sentence, I have no idea what I was going to say. So I wouldn't raise my hand. That went on my entire life until I started taking achievement tests in high school and having these high scores. I was getting it. I was just often getting it after the test had been taken. I made tons of mistakes. They looked like careless mistakes, but it wasn't because I didn't care. It was because I had short circuits going on. A lot of the brain damage was in the corpus callosum, where you send things from one side of the brain to the other and coordinate things. Some things like tests, where you had to find the right answer and put G by the number one, I just could not do. It was kind of traumatic. And music pulled everything together. I could pull everything together that you needed to get a recognizably excellent product. Whereas I used to copy papers like 5 and 6 times in order to get them not to skip a line and leave things out and not be able to figure out where the thing was. And it would take 15 minutes to find the part that I left out. And it would be like 6 drafts to get every homework paper done, and so on. And really, even on the last one, I would then miss some things. So copying was one of the hardest things for me. So that was kind of traumatic. When I went away to college, I was able to get in a real good school because they really sort of discounted that my grades were pretty average, like a B student. But my achievement test scores were sky high. I had these horrible migraines from the time I was 10 years old, and sometimes 4 or 5 times a week. And then you'd be sick the next day, like a hangover type of feeling. And when I was over 40, a doctor finally said, "My goodness, do you have any trouble with your thoughts?" He began to show me all of these things that didn't look right on the scans. And I was like, would that be why I can't copy from one piece of paper to another? And he said, yes. And so I did finally get to learn that. You have no idea how much that means to a student that's dealing with something like that. It's not their fault. I just accepted they all thought I didn't care, that I was just non-caring, that I needed to care more. I needed to try harder. And I had no idea, but I have all these dead cysts in my brain. I was thrilled to find that out. And so I muddled through, and some great things happened in my life. And when we moved to Cleveland, somebody heard me do a little recital at the music school. And I was asked to do art song recitals that they played on the Cleveland Classical Music Station on Saturday afternoons and Sundays when no one's listening. I thought it was pretty great because there weren't very many of us that got to do those. I always did well with my choirs, and I eventually directed the Cleveland Messiah Chorus. And so I achieved some things that even other people didn't achieve. There were things that just seemed easy for me. And if something's easy for a person, they really ought to think about doing those things instead of the things that are nearly impossible. So Laura had not lived in Wood County most of her life, but she told me that living in Bowling Green reminded her of growing up in Northeast Oklahoma because of the ruralness. And I knew that in her poetic portrait, that I had to include musical metaphors, and decided that the prose poem was the best form for her story. Prose poetry is a form that appears contradictory as it looks like prose, and I have an example. I put the example up here for you to see. It looks right. It looks like prose, but it operates like poetry, right? It relies on the musicality and techniques of poetry, such as rhythm, repetition, and fragmentation for meaning. A prose poem, right, then reads like poetry. And in the first issue of the prose poem in International Journal, editor Peter Johnson explained, right, here's some quotes, just as black humor straddles the fine line between comedy and tragedy, so the prose poem plants one foot in prose, the other in poetry, both heels resting precariously on banana peels. As Laura's story was all about how she wasn't supposed to achieve what she did, I wanted to use a form that looks like something it's not. I also included musical terms and notations in the poem to show the importance of music in her life. So here's the first poem. Track 1, The Underachiever Blues. Because my brain couldn't copy the rote beats of the everyday, and short-circuited thoughts got stuck in one hemisphere, teachers labeled me a big L for underachiever. They called me careless, non-caring, not careful. It almost beat the song out of me. Because school was a hemiola, I counted in 3 beats instead of 2. Each breath felt like my last. Gym class was a dogged D. G major made more sense than math tests. I measured rhythm in a different time signature, made art song out of the sharps, and held out every flat. My life is a poem put to music. Because I didn't play the piano like a singer, because I never gave up though I was born feet first, because I created an improv number called Muddling Through, because no one gets up in the morning and decides to screw up. Music connected the parts that were missing. Music pulled together the cacophonous notes. Okay, the second poem in Laura's portrait is track 1, Reprise. The Underachiever Changed the Key. This song is about how she changed the key. Da-da-da-dum. She sang in the chorus at Princeton U, hit the high notes she learned from her mother, and grandmother 1 and grandmother 2. But let's not forget Miss Exa Hooker. Da-da-da-dum. When father died at the end of 4th grade, mother was working by 7:30, running the 1950s in high heels, mom's wantin' womanness incited talk. Not staying home, but building companies. Da-da-da-dum. 5th grade teacher wore rows of safety pins for the just-in-case ripped hems and collars, but also used big words to sow our brains, like a profusion of daffodils on the hill. Then grandmother's one mellifluous voice, honeyed like syrup right into her head. Da-da-da-dum. She married a sweetheart and had 2 kids. Remember summers at grandmother's farm, beating snakes out of blackberry bushes. Bam! Bam! See my hoe? No way am I scared. Da-da-da-dum. So as you can see, she changed the key with the chorus of women you just met. Okay, and so that was Laura's portrait. I'm going to talk about Lisa's portrait. Lisa is a spirited and spiritual individual. She is a 64-year-old African-American woman. Near the end of our interview, she emphasized that participating in this project was a way to ensure her legacy, as she is an only child raised by a mother who is an only child, who was raised by her grandmother who was an only child, as seen in a portion of the Poetic transcript of her interview that I'm going to share now. And this was a part in the interview where, I kind of asked, is there anything that we've missed talking about that we should talk about in order to understand your story? And here's my rendering of that. I'm single on purpose, still open to marriage, if a relationship opened at this age and stage of life, I will probably inherit children and grandchildren, and I would be open to that if discerning the relationship is right. I was raised as an only, my mother was raised as an only child, her mother was raised as an only child. So this idea of legacy and this project means a lot to me. I don't have any children to pass this on to. I don't have any grandchildren to pass this on to. And I have something worth passing on and something worth capturing. And I just love the idea of legacy that's wrapped up in this project. So that's important to me. That's important. And I think that that would be my final words. So her experiences in education, traveling internationally, and becoming a published author are crucial to understanding Dr. Chavers. She had always wanted to become an author and was encouraged by college professors and others. The final push was a friend who mentioned how Lisa's story of ministering in Haiti were worth writing down. Lisa's books, and you see the covers of the two books here on the slide, the Rhythm of Relationships and the Rhythm of Resolve. And you'll notice that they have the word rhythm in the titles to mirror her experiences of being connected with others. And I wrote a skinny poem, and that's the one I began with, but I'm going to share it again to highlight the message in her books and interview, right? The importance of relationships. And it was something important to highlight to show her journey to become an author and how the title of the books of our lives are rooted in our experiences. And the skinny poem is a really good, yeah, there we go. You can see it on that slide. It's a good form for showing emotion and for compressing data. And I found that it really left the essence of her experience as an author and why she wrote books. And so I'm gonna, I'll read it again, right? The Rhythm of Relationships. Life is learning to write the book without a title. Relationships have a heartbeat. Relationships are the rhythm. Relationship, a book without a title. Life is learning to write. The other thing is when I thought of a color that would describe Lisa, and I don't know if you ever do that, somehow it just seemed like, maybe she had this like red aura around her, or aura. And that's what I thought of when, I really thought of Lisa. The colors associated with passion, sacrifice, heat, activity, love, joy, and courage. And also red was a prominent color. Let me see if I can go back. My mouse likes to disappear. On, right, her book covers, right? We see, red, right, in this figure. And so Lisa's second poem that I wrote is called The Rhythm of Red. I'm senior enough now to know the cadence of relationships, how to brick a foundation in jasper stone and pour into someone. My grandparents found the courage to love for 62 years by roughing out a heart with community. I am old enough now that I write my legacy in shades of red. Use the energy of saying yes to stretch the boundaries of what is by not copycatting the picture of life. My lips turn scarlet playing the hand-me-down trumpet my uncle gifted me. My fingers tap out the color of family on the piano. My hands beat a chorus on the Ghanaian drum that centers everything relationships are. Aunt Edna's father, the Reverend John Henry, was a reddish brown guy with real fine waves. When he showed up on the scene, respect and honor from the community. He bought a plot of land in Twinsburg in 1930 when African Americans didn't own much. 93 years later, this land reminds me to live up to my name, to do things afraid, to know a defining moment. Okay, so that was Lisa. And Here's some other photos. We're going to be including these in the archive. These are some of the photos. Lisa with her father. Um, and this was also another big part of Lisa's story in the Poetic transcript that I didn't get to share with you was when Lisa had gotten an EDD. So Lisa worked in undergraduate and graduate admissions here at BGSU a while ago, and that kind of intellectual stimulation and education achievement was very important to Dr. Chavers. So here's a picture of her with her former bosses and her degree. Okay, and the final story that I'm going to share with you is about Jean. Jean is an 80-year-old white woman who is a hairstylist. Sorry, let me adjust. She no longer has a beauty license nor owns a salon anymore, but she told me that she never stopped doing hair. The interview with Jean was not like the others, and that we talked at my kitchen table because she did not want to meet at the university. When she arrived at my house, she looked around my place a bit, sat down at the kitchen table, and started talking. So I had to scramble to find the recording button on my phone and my laptop. And like most conversations at the kitchen table, there was a lot of extraneous noise. My dogs barked. My husband walked in. The salt shaker fell off the table with a loud crash. However, this setting seemed to be what Jean needed to tell me her stories. She stopped occasionally to talk to the dogs, noticed that my snake plant was dying for water in the corner, and that we had the same pot rack. I did not ask many questions, as she needed to tell me what she needed to tell me. She experienced trauma because her daughter had a series of seizures over a 2-day period when she was 12. The doctors had to give her daughter too much strong medicine, enough to kill a horse, to get them to stop, and Jean's daughter ended up with short-term memory problems and disabled as a result. Jean thought at the time it may have been part of the Tylenol poisoning in the 80s. Now she knows they were epileptic seizures. Her daughter has endured hardships ever since. Then her son died when he was 55 years old. He was in the Army, served in the Gulf War, and had a daughter that Jean adores. She also had to overcome the stigma of growing up poor. And I know that at the beginning of the talk, I said, oh, this was a 3-step process, right? You do the interview, you do a poetic transcript, right? Then you create this. But I decided not to craft a poetic transcript for this particular story because the interview was over 4 hours. I felt that it would not have captured the essence of the interview. So I worked directly from my notes after the interview and the audio transcript to write a poem in 4 parts. In some ways, I argue that the poem is like a poetic transcription because of the details I included. Jean wanted her story to be about flowers because I reminded her of her mother and her sister who were her life support. And that was exactly what she said when she immediately sat down at the table. She's like, I want you to write my story about flowers. And that was a refrain kind of during the interview. This poem is also the most explicitly ethnographic because I included my insights with the use of the ethnographer as a narrator. I had to relay the trauma in her life before I could get to the flowers, because the trauma shows why flowers are so important and rooted in survival and resilience. The details of the story needed to be told in explicit language, and I felt seeing and hearing them makes the audience, right, you all bear witness. And there's a rich tradition of poetry as witness. I'm here thinking of Carolyn Forcher's work. So Jean tells the ethnographer she wants her story to be about flowers. 1, but first, you must witness her 80 years of living and working and parenting in a small rural town with roadside ditches built to mask the swamp this place once was, as if The past could be drained away. Note how she picks her thumb with her forefinger to keep herself rooted at the kitchen table, telling the ethnographer the stories that fall from her timeline as if they happened just now. Her hair looks good because she sleeps in brush rollers to represent old hairdressers. She's the last one alive who did hair at the Historical Museum and the nursing home where ladies lined up in wheelchairs, pin curls and bobby pins at the poorhouse too. The ethnographer asks about the flowers scattered on her purple shirt. Flowers, flowers, flowers. I want you to concentrate on that. How they grow out of the weeds of terrible times. 2. When you grow up in Hogtown, in a house built after World War II, with no electricity, water, or sewer lines, in that part of town, with tar paper shacks marring open fields, words are a loaded gun. Poor white trash, not good enough, you'll end up PG'd. The legacy of poverty and alcoholism and the headlines of family violence are a stain that no one wants to talk about or warn you about. So you end up marrying a drunk because you're going to love him so much he'll never drink. Then you marry a classmate because you had 2 kids. He was going to change your life because he was wealthy, always had 9 semi-trucks on the road. But he did not bother to come home when the first baby died. After the second baby died, he asked you at the hospital, when are you going to quit feeling sorry for yourself? And ended the marriage with a phone call. That was that. When you have done hair for 57 years in a small town, you know the color of everyone's roots, the scars on their underbellies. You learn that friendship is not a free comb out when they show up at your place with rollers in their hair. When you mother a daughter who you thought was poisoned in the cyanide-laced Tylenol scare in the 80s, who seized so violently for 2 days that the rest of her life has been a series of tsunamis, you show up, even on the days when she hates you. The pregnancy, the memory problems, being taken advantage of. What I want you to know is that none of this was her fault. When your son collapsed on a street in Ireland, dead at 55, an Army veteran who served in Operation Desert Storm, you tell the ethnographer about how you drove on unknown bridges and roads to Chicago and Georgia, though you get lost in people's houses because he needed you. 3, what you need to know. I love flowers. I love history. I love recycling. Once Aunt Daisy chopped down all the flowers in Mother's garden because she didn't know a weed from a doorknob. Mother always put the dandelions I picked in a water glass and sat them on the windowsill as if they were roses of the holler. Here's some advice for your snake plant I see dying in the corner. Take a banana peel and put it in water overnight. Drain the water and feed your houseplants all the potassium they need. You can repurpose anything. You can make a pill case from 2 Gatorade caps and the neck of a bottle, plant containers from Folger cans. When my sister was dying of cancer, we talked about flowers, and I planted them in coffee cans in her yard like a greeting card. I courted my Charlie with purple petunias that I bedded in the front of his trailer. I chased him until he caught me. 46 years now, and I'm crazy in love. If it weren't for flowers, I would be a raving lunatic. 4, And here's a line by Louise Glick, and I don't know if you all know that she died a few days ago. And I actually had put this in here before I had known this. And you all know that when I was sorry, I'm gonna have to say this before I get to the last line, but when I was thinking about Jean's story and the importance of flowers, I immediately thought of the wild iris. And so this the last part of the poem includes a line from Louise Glick. At the end of my suffering, there was the door. And it kind of plays on the golden shovel form, if you all know that. So I know you're really not supposed to say this like when you're doing readings, but what you'll notice is that at the end of every line is that parts of that poem, right? The end of my suffering, there was a door. I was born in Hogtown at the edge of the city. What I want at the end of my story is you to know that I'm made of the tenacity of dandelions, the passion of my petunias. The point of our suffering is to be planted and replanted there in the shadows of the September sun. I was grown in the great black swamp, a tendril that leads to an open door. So that was Jean. And in conclusion, poetic inquiry blurs the lines between social science and humanities, given the focus on the aesthetic and what poetry as an art form offers us to us as social researchers and artists. This project contributes to the literature on older women through an artful presentation of their lives. The use of poetic portraits as art-based research offers an evocative method of engaging with participants' stories to challenge dominant ideologies and stereotypes by including marginalized voices and perspectives. This project furthers poetic portraiture as an art-based research method by showing how the poetic representation of lives is empathic, reflective research practice and allows for multiple approaches to meaning making. And thank you for your attention. I think we have time for questions.
Thank you so much, Sandra. The poems were absolutely gorgeous and the stories behind them. And, this whole aspect of the participatory, the you and the them and the third thing, which was the poem that came, is just absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for sharing them with us.
Thank
And
you.
I'm pretty sure there are many questions, comments. There were so many comments in the chat box. I just want to toss in the first one, and it's more of a comment actually than a question. But I do feel that your poetic inquiry method and what you're doing in general is it could greatly enhance this whole notion of researcher reflexivity. I don't know if Louise is with us. Louise is still with us. So Louise will be giving a course on researcher reflexivity in a couple of weeks. And I don't know, I think Louise, you'd probably be thinking the same. But this is absolutely amazing. And yeah, I think it's a huge leap also in research, the whole reflexivity, participatory element in it.
Thanks. I'm going to be,
And
yeah, go ahead. Are there some questions? I was trying to look.
no, go ahead. Let me just
Um,
pin your screen here.
yeah, I was just going to say, part of this is kind of nerve-wracking when I give the portrait, right, to a participant. And I was really nervous with Jean because I thought, oh, she did come to tell me her story, but I was so nervous, right, to give her that. But she, says that she loves it. And I'm giving a public presentation here, and I've invited all the women that's going to be in person here in like 3 weeks. So I'm hoping that most of them can make it, right, as honored guests. And it'll be kind of interesting to see some of their reactions when, I present it out loud. Sally,
Wow, sure, that would be interesting.
you have your hand raised.
Hi, Sandra.
Sally.
I loved hearing at the International Auto Ethnography when you did that duo with your ex kind of boyfriend. That was just fantastic. So I just wanted to say that while I'm here. I was in a meeting this morning with some colleagues who are trying to work with funders for research. And I put it in the thing, they were asked, okay, so what's better about doing arts-based research that's different to focus groups? And of course, yeah, I kind of know and feel that, and I'm not involved in their research project. And that they were like, well, we don't want to see something as better. They were like, not wanting a hierarchy. There's just different ways. But I just wondered what might be your answer to that, because yeah, for me, it kind of feels bleeding obvious. It kind of, the emotion and the evocativeness that comes out. But I wondered what you might say to funders.
Yeah, I mean, I did get a fellowship to work on this project, right? This, but it was through an Institute for Culture and Society, so they kind of got it. I think that's what you do, is just maybe show what the impact could be, with these art-based projects. And I know I'm about to apply for funding for some other project that's not really art-based, but but even doing qualitative work sometimes, because I always want to see like pilot data. So I don't know. I don't know if maybe you had some public readings, or you just find, I mean, there is research on how art, right, actually can make people feel, more empathetic. And so I think maybe that's what you go for, is you try to find some of the scientific
The language they understand.
yes, evidence to then show it. And then, maybe you even include some of that. I mean, some of the, the poems or whatever it is that you're putting in there, as kind of as a form of evidence. But
Or
I would,
or
yeah.
just play this recording, Sandra. Just play your recording. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Sally. I see Felipe has his hand up.
Yes, thank you. Hello, Sandra. Huge fan. I'm doing my PhD at the moment in educational research using somewhat similar methodology, and I'm thinking about the presentation of the poems, and I'm playing with the idea of asking the participants to read them and record that reading. What do you think about that?
I think that's a great idea.
Do you
Yeah.
do you think that, like, because when you read this stuff, it was amazing, you had sort of that pace. Do you think that maybe the participants in your research would read them differently, and that would sort of
Yeah, I mean, the
make a
thing about
difference?
poetry is that it matters, right? The way that it looks on the page. Yeah, I imagine they might, but that was the thing with the poetic transcription, is that, you try to kind of mirror how they're talking. Now, I will say that I took some of the disfluencies out, the ums and some of the some of the repeated words when I was doing the poetic transcriptions. But as I was reading it, it's like I can hear the voice of the participants in my head, right? Because of the way that it's laid out on the page. I imagine, sure, even, if you write the poem, it might be a little bit different, but isn't that the great thing about poetry, is that it's able to hold those contradictions, and it's able to hold multiple ideas and multiple voices. So I don't know that it would matter that your reading might be a little bit different than a participant's reading. I mean, I would actually embrace that as something positive.
Thank you, Felipe, for the question. And Sandra, I can't see any hands up. Let me just flip through because they're not all on the same column. Right, would anyone like to ask Sandra a question? You might also want to just pop the question in the chat box. Oh, Lisa. Hi, Lisa and Jean.
Yes,
So
hi,
both.
I'm Lisa. I just wanted to ask about how many like how much of the language in the pieces were the participants and how much was yours, and did that depend on the piece? And just kind of if you could maybe say a little bit about that, just of how much how
That's
much
a
is
great
your voice, how much is their
question.
voice? Yeah.
That's a great question because sometimes it's a little tricky. Like you saw the poetic transcripts, I read a few of those, and there's some places in Jean's, for instance, the four part where her voice was, I actually italicized, I mean, you can't see this, but I italicized her like direct, right, quotes there. Um, and I did try to use some of their language, although it was interesting, like in Lisa's, I have something about, I wrote this, the rhythm of red, and I have a line about how to brick a foundation. I mean, and some of this is just my lines. That was not Lisa's. And she had asked me, well, Jasper Stone, like, where did that come from? But I was looking up everything that's red in nature because I was like, okay, I've got to get lots of red stuff in here since I'm, in essence, kind of writing this poem about, the rhythm of red. Because as I'd mentioned, for some reason, I just kept thinking of the color red when I was thinking about Lisa and her story. So, I think it differs by the poems. But in Laura's story, she was talking about her mother, because her father died right when she was 30. I mean, when she was young, her father was 30 when he died. He died of cancer. And so but he had taught her mother, he was in the insurance business. And so she was doing this in the 50s, right? Well, because she left the house at 7:30 in the morning in high heels. Oh my goodness. This was like, you weren't supposed to wear high heels, right? That early in the morning. And so I knew, and she said that they were describing her mother's wanton womanness. And I was like, oh, that is a great line. That's got to go right in the poem. So that's where the process of creating poetic transcriptions, like sometimes some of the language just kind of really popped out and you're like, yeah, I've got to put that in there. But at the same time, sometimes you have to balance it with some poetic license. Like, I don't think the poetic transcripts are poetry. I wouldn't make that argument. I mean, they kind of look like poetry, but they're not poetry. So, kind of to answer your question, like, some of it really depended on the poem, but yes, some of their, exact language is in some of the poems. That was a great question. Let's see.
Thank you,
Jean.
Lisa and Jean. Jean's hand is up.
Good evening, everyone. Hi, Sandra. I just wanted, it's a comment, not really a question. I actually met you when you were in South Africa at the Symposium of Poetic Inquiry,
Terrific.
and I got to witness some of your beautiful poetry. Um, and I just want to say thank you so much. I'm doing my master's in social sciences and psychology, and I'm focusing on the indigenous people in South Africa. And I've just really been drawn to you and how you've been so committed to using poetic inquiry, not only so much as a creative academic instrument, but in pushing the dialogue for marginalized voices, And it's just so refreshing, especially for someone like me. Like, I'm currently battling with my supervisors because they're like, how are we going to mark this? Is this even like an academic thing? And I'm like, this is exactly what I'm trying to do. This is the colonization that we're trying to fight against.
Send me an email and I'll send you some like sources that you can make the argument for all of that. Like, I've had to do that, but yeah, I think sometimes it's unfortunate. Sometimes you just have to do that. And there is enough published work now that, right, as a method, and we can talk about criteria, which are a little bit different, right? So that's it. They might be trying to apply a set of criteria that doesn't work for poetic inquiry, right? So or inquiry. But so if you just, you can, if you email me here, I'll put my email in the chat here. I can send you a list of references to make that argument.
Thank you. I will definitely do that. And it's just like I think people also underestimate the power of what poetic inquiry is, because like I had a meditation session and all these messages were coming to me, and they were like, you need to actually find a way to reference in your academic studies things that are not considered referenceable, like your intuition, like spiritual messages, like spiritual guides, like emotion. You need to code that. You need to provide a language for people to start speaking. So I appreciate what you're doing. It's a war. It's combative, and it's gentle. And yeah, I just want to thank you so much for your work.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Jean. And also thank you for highlighting this tension between academia and poetic inquiry. There's somehow some sort of a mistrust for collaboration. The collaboration such as the one that Sandra just showed us, and also maybe reflection. It's kind of scary sometimes in academia. I mean, even when it's accepted, it just shouldn't be there in your thesis. So thanks for bringing it out. We need to see more creative theses coming up. And I see Tony. Hello, Tony.
Hi. This is very interesting for me because I'm currently a fellow at the Institute of Medical Humanities in Durham University in the UK in the Narrative Practices Lab. And so I've been finding it very interesting to hold in my mind the concept of poetic inquiry when I'm working in an environment of narrative inquiry. And so there's definitely a difference there, which is very fascinating and very something I need to work with and to bring back into my own practice. My question and my work and my approach has always been an autoethnographic approach. And so my interest was in how one folds into the data gathering, to use a boring academic way of doing this, of listening to people and listening to their stories, and then processing that into a poetic form of presentation, a performative term, which is poetic, essentially. How do you acknowledge the contributions of those people whose stories have contributed to this? And in my work, they always want to be acknowledged. They've given up a story of a really shitty experience they've had with healthcare. They want to be acknowledged for what they've given. How do you do that when you applied a creative turn to that and then represented it? It's fascinating. So yeah, thank you.
So I think for many of the participants, being listened to was something new, right, for them. Deeply, right, listened to, because they, kept asking, like, why are you interested in older women? And I think, many of them were kind of delighted that their stories are going to then be archived. Right.
Yep.
So that's part of it. Now, I did this something similar with Poetic Portraiture with some research interviews that then weren't archived, and some of the stories. I mean, it was interesting to me that Jean told me these stories, even though they're going to be archived.
Because
but she actually seemed kind of delighted, right, to be able to, get to talk, and that, now this is, other people can learn from it. So, and I think even if you weren't doing an archive project, what it is, we would give the poetic portraits back to women as kind of a gift, right? Gift it kind of back to them. And that was some of the kind of reciprocity there.
Thank you. That really does feel like valuing the input of the people whose experiences you're working with, which is, I think, incredibly important. So,
thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you. And if you would like also to use the chat box to give us the link to your work, then that would also be wonderful. Thank you. And next, I see Ali's hand.
Uh, Good morning from Brisbane. I am Ali. I just recently completed my PhD. I was working with exploring the stories of women from refugee background journeying to higher education. I used conversation as a method in my thesis, and of course, when I felt stuck, I took help of your work and also Laura Richardson to use some poetic expression. As I come from a background, my language, English is not my first language, it's third, fourth language, and I used some poetic expressions. But the big questions usually come with about the technicality and also the quality of the poetry. So I was there were question that is that it is the poetry or not? It was a big question. Particularly in the examination and everything, it was a lot of big question. So my question is that is there any criteria to be it should be called poetry, or how we can if is there any way that we can improve that where our poetic
Yes,
expression? Yes.
absolutely. And so I'm actually going to give all of these poems to a poet friend of mine for, critique, because I want them to be working as poems as well. And there is a tension, there's always a tension in this work between the epistemic, right, and the aesthetic. It's like there's certain things I want to get across, right, because of the stories and the knowledge, but then I also kind of want it to work as art. And that's why I would argue poetic transcription, the poetic transcripts aren't actually poems, right? They're poem-like. And you may even ask yourself in particular projects, where do I want to be on that continuum? Is it more important that this work works at poetry, or is it more important that somehow it's on the epistemic end, that it's, I'm trying to teach something, and, maybe then I would use more words from participants, even if they're not quite as poetic, right? So I would say it also depends on each goal that you have for a project, because there's some projects where I've done that where it's like I wouldn't say that the poetic renderings, right, are that great of poetry, right? But it didn't matter for what I was doing. So, some of it might depend on the audience, for instance. I offer some poetic criteria, right, that you can use too. So you think about, does it, discovery, surprise. Now I have to remember all of this. There's like five things. Does your, art also speak to, to some of the other artists? So, is it somehow in, speak to something about that tradition? So, I don't know if that answers your question, right? So it kind of depends on the project. And yes, there's a set of criteria. So great.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ali, for your question. And next up is Daniel. Hello, Daniel.
Hello. Thanks for your presentation, Sandra. I thought it was great. I would really love to do this myself. I'm not sure. This is maybe a comment. I'm not sure if this is an accurate observation, so maybe you can tell me. But I edit a lot of psychology dissertations that are, most of them use some form of qualitative interviewing, like IPA, the listening guide, which also uses some poetry. But what I was kind of noticing, which I really love about the poetic inquiry method, because I'm not that familiar with it, is that, and I don't know if this is just sort of the psychology bias and wanting to sort of protect participants and remain confidential, but I almost feel like in what I'm used to editing and reading, so much of the personal details are kind of omitted for the sake of seeking out some sort of essence of an experience. Whereas this is like, here are these people, here are their faces, here are their families. And I just feel so much more connected to them in the poems, in the stories, even in your little descriptions of this is what happened when I met them, or this is how they presented. They just feel so much more alive to me. So
Well, and
that's
we
my
could,
thing.
could argue too, that for some poetry, in order for it to be universal, like, because I would also argue that poetry can be universal, right? And that it can speak to those themes, is that you want to have very concrete details there.
Yeah.
So some of this, some of the specificity, right, has got to be there. Now, there's some people who might be doing like language poetry or even lyrical poetry, right, can have some of those concrete details. And so that would be the argument that I would make, because if some of your goal is to evoke something, and really the goal here is to capture something about their stories, right, that seem to be important. And if it's going to be some kind of embodied experience, yes, language is not the experience itself, so the poem is not their story, it's not, right, but it can be an experience when you hear it, when you read it, when you, right, if you kind of feel it. I mean, that's what good poetry to me, I feel it, physically. So but it's because of some of the specific details that you include.
Yeah. Well, and the
Yeah.
images as well, like the book covers and clippings, and it's just like, yes, these are real human beings. It's not just a transcript floating on a page.
Right.
So thank you. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Sarah and Sandra and Daniel. I'm wondering if anyone wrote a question in the chat box and we didn't see it. In the meantime, we will answer Sharon. Just in case someone's question dissolved in the chat box, please copy it and then repost it again so that we can see it freshly. So Sharon.
Hello, good evening. I'm Sharon from Malta. Sandra, I have referenced you. Hi, Sally. Quite a bit in my doctoral, which I finished last January. I used the evocative autoethnography. I wrote about women living with autoimmune invisible illnesses, and also had narratives. I gathered I had held 4 conversations with women also living with invisible chronic illnesses. I was the first to use autoethnography in our university, and so that was a challenge in itself. And I understand the hurdles that one can experience. I've been there, I've done that. What I did is, with the conversations, speaking about illness in a small country with one main hospital where people could be very much identifiable. I presented their words using found poetry. So I used their own words, and that's how I presented their conversations. Obviously, I needed to be careful to be ethically correct that they are not identifiable. And what I did is I presented I called it raw poetry because I don't consider myself as doing poetry, but that's how I presented it. And that made a really big impact even on the page, let alone reading it. That's what I was told. And what I plan to do now postdoctoral is have a discussion around that poetry. So
Terrific. That sounds wonderful.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and one of the good things about poetry too is that you can fictionalize some things. Like if you're working in a really small community and you think some things would come back, that's one way to handle it, right? You can still get kind of at the narrative truth or the essence of something, but then it's right fictionalized, or in that case, you could do some kind of amalgam of stories, right? And then it would be difficult to, right, be able to pinpoint like one or two individuals. Here, because it's the archive project and I'm getting all of their permission, I'm working back and forth before we would put it there, present it, then obviously their names are, right, they are attached here. So, I have a bit more freedom, because of that. But when I've, worked with other projects like you were talking about, I've kind of used that fictionalize things, right, for ethical reasons. Oh, I see.
Thank you. Clancy?
Hi, have been working on some projects using poetic inquiry. I'm pretty new to the method, and mine are not based on transcripts with research participants. What I'm doing to say a bit about one project is I've saved donor letters for several years now from organizations that are promoting reproductive freedom, like Planned Parenthood and other such organizations. And so I have this corpus of letters, and I've been using poetic inquiry to create poems from those. So I'm just wondering if you have some advice for people using poetic inquiry on texts that are not interview transcripts.
Oh, that's terrific. I mean, then you could be doing things like found poetry. There's a whole rich tradition, right, of that. And even, poets who are using that. Oh gosh, now I've just forgotten the poet, but they had just done some, had used some transcripts of like some of the Black Lives, oh no, it escaped. I'm going to remember it when we're done. But had done some even like blackout poetry on some, you could do that with, right, some of the letters. That would be kind of fascinating. So that's what I would look at: erasure poetry, blackout poetry, found poetry. It seems like those would be some good forms with the materials that you have.
All right, thank you.
Ferguson report. Yeah, Nicole, thank you. Thank you. Yes, I was just thinking Nicole Celia, the Ferguson report. Thanks.
Thank you. So I guess I don't see any more new questions, but I just want to finish off with one last question / comment before we move to the lucky draw. And we also want to make a really fun announcement. It's about Sandra. Anyway, Sandra, thank you so much for sharing this. It is absolutely amazing what you do with other people's stories. And as you know, I mean, poetic inquiry takes on many different forms. And you've seen, as for example, what we did with engaging with images. There are stories, somehow stories that are untold, but stories about yourself, psychic stories about your own self that come out through images and also through many different ways of poetic inquiry. Now, when you have conversations with other people and write about other people, do you also feel that you're also uncovering stories about yourself, or is there something about yourself that you learn and discover through learning about others? You do.
Always, always. And I think that's where the reflexivity part comes in, right? You should always be, thinking that. So yeah, because I will be writing, because I've written some poems in response to this particular project. So and we'll have a kind of autoethnographic narrative piece about some of that.
Well, this has been amazing, Sandra. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing those incredible poems and ideas. And for those of you who are here, I just want to tell you, very proudly announce that Sandra will be heading over to the UK for our Women Who Create conference. We've had a Women Who Create conference in 2023. We're going to have another one on the 23rd and 24th of March. We haven't yet announced it on our social media or our website, so you are all the first people to know about this. And Sandra will be our keynote speaker. So we'll be posting the CFP pretty soon. And for those of you who would like to present, feel free to submit your abstracts. For those who just want to attend, also please feel free to do so. It's going to be a hybrid conference, so you can join us online if you can't make it to Cambridge. It's going to be at the University of Cambridge, by the way, Lucy Cavendish School. So we hope to see you there. We're greatly looking forward to having Sandra with us, and hearing more about what's coming up next. So thank you, Sandra. Thank you for being here today, and thank you for being our honorable and esteemed keynote speaker in the next few months. And right now, the prize will be a free ticket to our Women Who Create conference so that you could meet Sandra, hopefully in person. Hopefully you can make it in person. Now, we're not including tickets and fares and trains and all that. This is just the entrance ticket, so please don't get me wrong here. So we hope you can make it. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen so that we can spin the wheel together. Okay, so let's do this. 1, 2, 3, and the winner is LeConte. Are you here?
It's been again.
Oh, not here?
It's been again, I think.
Okay, so let's
I'm
spin
here.
it again. Oh, you're here.
I was just trying to unmute myself.
Hello. Wait, let me try to unpin Sandra. Oh, there you are. So, hello, LeConte. Nice to meet you, and congratulations.
Thank you.
So we hope to see you in March, whether online or in person. Congratulations. This will be a wonderful opportunity to hear Sandra and all the other amazing women who will be sharing their work with us. So, LeConte, if you'd also like to submit, if you'd like to share your work, again, this will be free of charge for you because you won the prize.
Awesome. Thank you.
So thank you, everyone, and wishing you all a lovely day/evening, depending on where you're joining us from. So see you again very soon. We have another event tomorrow about the uncanny in literature, and our featured speaker will be Erin Daniels. It's also a free event. So if you are interested in signing up, we still have a few tickets available. So thank you, thank you, thank you, Sandra, and thank you all for being here. Have a great day. Bye-bye.